This is a Squiz podcast. We're your shortcut to being informed.
On January 20th, President Joe Biden's first and only term as President of the United States will come to an end as Donald Trump starts his second term. So with that about to happen, this Squiz Shortcut will get you across what Biden achieved over the last 4 years, where the critics say he fell short, and what steps he's taken in his last weeks in the White House. Squiz Shortcuts is the backstory to the big news stories. I'm Andrew Williams.
And I'm Claire Kimball.
Joe Biden has been on the American political scene for a long time. He started his political career in the Senate representing the state of Delaware in 1973. He was vice president to Barack Obama between 2008 and 2016. And in 2020, he defeated Donald Trump to become president himself. There's a lot to look at, therefore, as his political career comes to an end.
We're not going to look at all of it, though, Andrew. Just the last bit. I think Squizzes will be very happy that we're not going over 50 years of political history.
That would not be a shortcut.
Not a shortcut, after all. But look, let's look at the last bit when he was president. When he ran, he said that he stood for two things: the American working class and a unified America. But the times were very tricky over the last 4 years. So a lot of what's being reflected on now are the things that he had to deal with. And those are the issues, the big current issues, global issues of the last 4 years.
Yeah, the best laid plans of any president, really. When you say the times were tricky, he took office in January 2021, so the pandemic was still very much a thing. And then, of course, there are the economic consequences that stem from that.
Yeah, so economic management is always a threshold test for a national leader. There's lots of views about whether Biden did a good job of that or not. We're not here to add to that discussion. That's not our bag. The experts and the pundits can certainly say a lot about that, and they will over the coming few weeks. But certainly you can point to what he did, and the dollar values on a couple of policies were really huge. Biden's $1.2 trillion infrastructure law made major investments in roads and bridges and broadband. It's something that will last far beyond his presidency. And that got bipartisan support. So that's no mean feat, that big infrastructure bill. And then, Andrew, there was the $2.2 trillion Inflation Reduction Act.
Yeah, and that was in 2022. It was the biggest climate-related bill in American history, and also at the same time, one of the largest investments in the American economy, a common theme.
Yeah, so the idea was that it created opportunities to build projects, to hire workers, to manufacture equipment in America that was needed to strengthen the domestic supply chains there, also lower household energy costs and reduce greenhouse gas emissions at the same time, while paying good wages to workers who are working on those projects. Lots of debate, though, about whether those investments were actually inflationary.
Yeah, it's a similar discussion that we're having here about the Albanese government's spending and its impact on inflation or otherwise. And the Biden administration spending didn't end there. There was the $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan, which gave Americans cash to cope with the downturn associated with the pandemic. And then there was the $280 billion, these are big numbers, CHIPS Act that aimed to position the US to outcompete China essentially in producing semiconductors and other advanced tech.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it, when a $280 billion program is dwarfed by things in the trillions. And look, yeah, a lot of government money has been spent in America. One of the themes of the last presidential election was how US government debt has risen to $36.17 trillion. That's about 133% of their GDP. So for comparison, Australia's government debt level is about 30% of our GDP.
And to decipher that, if numbers make your head go a bit funny, as they do for me from time to time, there are theories about how much debt a government should have, and that is measured, as you say, against GDP, which is the dollar amount of how much a country produces in goods and services. So to have more debt than what a country would produce in a year is a lot of debt.
Yeah, it's a lot, and that's very well said, Andrew. Thank you for tidying me up there. But what Team Biden say is that it's been a situation that's come about because of COVID, and it was on them to keep the US economy afloat, not just for America and Americans, but for the whole world. And as we get to the end of Biden's term, inflation is still a thing in the US, but its Federal Reserve has started to cut interest rates there.
Unlike the Australian Reserve Bank, which is very much a live topic in Australian political and economic discussions. We'll leave the economy there, though, and we'll take a look at some of the other things that the Biden administration did and didn't do up next. Claire, Biden's record in international relations, particularly the ongoing wars in Gaza and Ukraine, along with a chaotic withdrawal of the US troops from Afghanistan, are all seen as ways that the Biden administration may have come up short.
Yeah, certainly that's how some analysts see it. Joe Biden had decades of foreign relations experience when he came to office, and he promised to restore faith in US leadership globally and also rally international support to challenge China's aggression. But the current wars that you mentioned have really taken up a lot of bandwidth.
And that's seen Donald Trump's promise to distance America from international conflicts resonate with a lot of voters. Another thing to note is in the last few weeks, Biden's announced a major arms package to Ukraine as well. And another element of international relations is illegal migration, which is very much a hot button issue in the US, particularly around the southern border.
Yeah, it sure is. And across Biden's term, migrants crossed America's southern border, so that border with Mexico, at record rates. And that overwhelmed government resources and also cities that couldn't handle the number of people who were arriving. When Biden entered the White House, he promised a more humane system. He also launched new pathways for asylum seekers to be able to come to America and stay in America, and also made it easier for some spouses of US citizens to get green cards, so the ability to work in America. But that crisis at the border really saw Biden impose a controversial policy. It effectively banned asylum at the border, and that did bring crossings down, but it has been a crisis across his presidency.
And as a result, a big issue at the election. Donald Trump has made it very clear he will crack down and deport many who are living in the US illegally. So, Claire, there's a couple of big policy areas, but if we steer away from policy, the idea of policy, I reckon a lot of people, when they think about Biden, will think about the abandoned presidential run.
Yeah, he made that run despite ongoing questions about his age and popularity. He was very committed to running. And actually, just this week, he said that he thinks he could have beaten Donald Trump if he'd stayed in the presidential race instead of dropping out and endorsing his vice president, Kamala Harris.
Yeah, he's holding firm, but it seems pretty much everyone else, including Democratic political strategists, think that his tilt at a second term was a mistake. And as for Harris, they say there wasn't enough time to build her up with the public because Biden made that decision to exit so late.
Yeah, and there's criticism that he failed to enable a new generation to take over the Democratic Party during his term.
Yeah, so as that term comes to an end, he has been very active in his final weeks. He's still creating lots of headlines.
Yeah, and the move that probably got the biggest headlines is his pardon of his son Hunter. Biden had promised not to grant his son a pardon for tax and gun charges, but he changed his mind in early December. That was about a month after the Democrats lost that election. There are more pardons expected to be on the way, so keep a lookout for that in the coming week. He's also banned oil drilling off the American coast.
Yeah, that relates to the entire East Coast and West Coast, the eastern Gulf of Mexico, and a portion of the Bering Sea. So oil and gas companies that want to find or produce offshore oil, they have to pay the US government to lease sections of the ocean. And Biden's action prohibits any new leases in those identified regions.
Yeah, it doesn't affect any existing leases though, and there are heaps of rigs out there drilling for oil and gas now. It's an effort though to protect those areas from new activity. Trump, of course, has vowed to access oil there.
And the experts say that Biden's decision is going to make it hard for the incoming Trump administration to do that because it's going to be tough to overturn in the Congress. So that's one to keep an eye on. Biden's last day in office is fast coming up. Trump will be inaugurated on the 20th of January in Washington, D.C. And Claire, you and I, the whole Squiz team, will be glued to the television.
Absolutely.
So that's our shortcut to Joe Biden's legacy. Thank you so much for listening. Remember to share this episode with your mates who want to hear the backstory to the big news stories. And don't forget, if you have an idea for a future Squiz Shortcut, we love to hear them and we love to hear from you. So just flick it through to hello@thesquiz.com.au. Until next time.